What's going on, guys? We're going to be doing a spoiler review of Dune Part 2 today. I was lucky enough to see it more than once in movie theaters, and I'm ready to talk about it for quite a long time. Down below, we have the timestamps if you want to skip ahead to any part of the video. We do have Denis Villeneuve rankings at the end of the video if you want to go ahead and skip and watch that portion. Please do not forget to subscribe to the Movie Dive. Now let's get to the Dune Part 2 spoiler show. What's going on, guys, and welcome back. We are here with Matthew Gosling on the Movie Dive. He's been here before. We did Oppenheimer. What was the last one?
We also did Year in Review 2023.
That's right. So he was here for Oppenheimer and he was here for Year in Review. So yeah, we're going over Dune 2. This might be a long one. So hopefully, like while you're cleaning the house or something, then you can go ahead and listen to what's going on here. This is like more of a podcast format. I guess I'll get into quick thoughts of it. Of course, I mean, from the review, we already know that it's just an amazing movie. I was saying that it truly is as close to a 5-star rating as you can get, like without being a 5-star rating. Every movie is like held to different standards. For example, I also gave Zone of Interest 4.5, but this one is better, I think, than Zone of Interest. Who knows? It's honestly like in a year, it could easily turn into a 5-star movie. I liked it a lot more the second time I even saw it because I know more of the story and what's going on behind it. However, like the things that we'll talk about in our negatives still are like just hold it back a little bit for me. And it's like these negatives are not like real negatives. It's not like Madam Web. It's like, oh, they didn't do things that you learn to do first year of film school. They like blatantly didn't pay attention to. This was just more of like creative decisions that if I was in charge, which I never would be because I could never pull this off, would not be in, I would have just changed. Mm-hmm. And I also think, I was like thinking about this earlier, how like awesome it is. Like how, imagine being Denis Villeneuve, imagine being him. And like, when you're a kid, this is your favorite book and you see this come out in movie theater and it looks the way it does. I couldn't imagine like pulling that off. That's pretty insane. So that's like my quick thoughts to start this off here. Matthew hasn't really done a video review on this, so I'm going to give him a few minutes to talk about Dune Part 2, and we can kind of banter back and forth for a few minutes, and I'll cut out whatever I have to cut out later on. But if you want to go ahead on it.
Okay, so saw this Friday night, IMAX. I saw the first Dune, like the part one, also in IMAX, the opening night as well. Going in, this was like my most anticipated movie of last year. Obviously, it got pushed back because of the strikes, and they wanted to have Zendaya basically on the red carpet rather than striking and not because of the Screen Actors Guild stuff. So when it got delayed, I was so bummed. Imagine what the slate of 2023 would have looked like if this actually came out in November.
Yeah, so like I think 2023 is full of good movies, not like historical movies, but full of like good movies. And if this was in 2023, I would probably say this is 10 times better than Oppenheimer to me. As about the rate. I think this would have destroyed the Oscars with like the movies that were in 2023.
We can get into the Oscars. Oscars are weird. Oscars are a terrible barometer of what is actually a good thing or a bad thing.
But when it comes to like special effects, audio, all that, this will easily, I think, take those.
I don't know. That could be a further conversation. I don't know if it's easily because I know you mentioned Zone of Interest earlier. I think the sound design of Zone of Interest probably would still win. Cinematography, editing is kind of up in the air. All the production design stuff of this is just... I was so many times just caught by the Baron's like levitation throne thing with like all these little like air things that like maneuver. There was so much thought into all of like the production design. There's only so much stuff that we've already seen in some form, but the way that it's designed, the way it was carried out from a craft standpoint, felt just so different and alien and familiar at the same time that this just felt like one of those, wow, I've never quite seen it like that before. I wasn't obviously alive, or I was alive, but I wasn't cognizant to the point where when Jurassic Park came out and people actually sat down in the cinema and saw a T-Rex on screen like the way they did. I was like getting that kind of feeling, especially with the Samwell stuff. That is on the true like holy shit moments of the T-Rex encounter to me.
I guess like it's like small details that obviously make a movie go from like good to like great to a masterpiece.
Mm-hmm.
The suits that they were wearing or the outfits, like how real those look. I know Marvel, what they do from what I've heard is that this isn't really like shit on Marvel because they make so much stuff. Obviously, they're not making only one movie,
Mm-hmm.
but they put the character even in like Infinity War and Endgame, which I think are two of their best. They
Mm-hmm.
put characters in those tracking suits because then later on they're going to decide what they look like when they
Mm-hmm.
CGI them in.
Mm-hmm.
And in this movie, it's been planned probably like by storyboarded by Denis since he's been storyboarding this since he was
Mm-hmm.
14 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And you were talking about the worms. I also heard that they studied beatboxers and how their throats moved to like
Oh gosh!
to kind of like judge like how they wanted
Wow.
their worms to like move in a way like something that's like way more like loose and strong at the same time. I mean, me and you spoke about this beforehand. How much it just it really like makes me just like Star Wars more. Like I just
Mm-hmm.
the whole story about it. I'm just like this Star Wars was not original at all,
Mm-hmm.
and so many things that Star Wars was famous for, but they took so much story from this. Even Game of Thrones like has so much influence from Dune. You can tell.
Dune, obviously, because it's such a old book, published in 1965. It's been around a long time and has been adapted pretty poorly throughout the years, and no one's really given it a fair shot. I would have loved to seen like if you watch Jaredowski's Dune, which is a great documentary about
Mm-hmm.
Jaredowski, the director who tried. There's so much of like the design that goes into that failed adaptation of Doom, which is then carried over into Star Wars, like from the actual
Yeah,
like production design element side of things. So even without being properly adapted, it was already such a influential source material. Like even Matrix, like think of the Matrix. There was stuff with Chani and Paul in this, which felt very Neo Trinity. With the Desert Springs bringing him back, kind of like the fulfillment of the prophecy for Trinity, saying that she would fall in love with the one. There's just so much that has a literary context throughout modern cinema, especially that can be traced back to Dune. So being actually able to see Dune adapted well and stand on its own 2 feet rather than just having parts of it just like stolen from and then planted on some other IP, it's just the best. It's so cool to see that.
yeah, yeah. In Star Wars, I think a lot of the main theme, of course, was just like good versus evil. I think Dune is just like obviously so much deeper than that
Yeah.
about going fake prophets and people believing in something rather than just believing in themselves and how that
Mm-hmm.
like can bog your community down. Of course, we like compared to Game of Thrones, how everyone wants power.
Mm-hmm.
Even in this film, Timothy Chalamet's character, like that's what he ends up wanting is just the power. I think the only one in this film that doesn't search for the power as much as Zendaya's character.
Johnny, yeah.
Dune in general has just these overwhelming themes, and I know like going back to the first one, it makes the first one so much better,
Mm-hmm.
knowing how the second one will go and what it causes, and even from the scene of the movie where they're floating up that canyon, I'm just like, damn, this is this is what we're in for. How I don't understand how it's got to be so difficult to film out where they filmed. I know
Yeah.
it was out in Abu Dhabi and
Mm-hmm.
Jordan, and they always talk about during Mad Max how difficult it
Mm-hmm.
was filming that movie.
Mm-hmm.
And this one, Mad Max, you can tell that they hated the director.
Yeah.
Like Tom Hardy, like expressed how much he and Charlize Theron says she doesn't want to work with him ever again. They expressed so much during the filming how much they hated this guy. Then when they saw Mad Max, they're like, "Yes, this movie's fantastic," but you don't hear anyone bashing Denis Villeneuve
Mm-hmm.
over how much they disliked him. When I know it had probably the same exact issues filming out. It was probably so hot.
Mm-hmm.
It's like where are you staying? Like the bathroom situation, electricity and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The sand that gets probably in the cameras. So the feat that they pulled off making this movie is pretty insane
Yeah.
when you think about it.
Yeah. No, I agree. And the fact that they've, I don't think they actually filmed it necessarily straight back to back, if I remember correctly. And obviously,
No.
he's in the middle of writing Messiah at the moment. So obviously they're going to go back. We'll see what happens in terms of casting. But, there was at least a 2 movie sign up that they agreed to in principle assuming that it would have gone off the ground and didn't get cancelled and all that stuff after the pandemic. But the fact that they were so enthusiastic to almost like get back to the desert, I kind of felt that.
Yeah.
Coming out of Dune Part One, I think I put this in my Letterboxd review. My wife was like, "I can't wait to go back to that planet." That was the exact feeling like when we sat down and we see, Power of Spice. That Denis always loves doing those little like interstitials, like Sicario means hitman. He does that every single movie. There's some sort of like little like headstone text almost. But as soon as you get back into that desert, it's just like, man, this is where I want to be. This is just I don't want to physically be there, but I'm very happy to be sitting in this reclining IMAX chair and watching this.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot that went into like the production design, which was old school like model making, which probably helps things, so that not everything is just true green screen. There's some like scale models and that kind of stuff, especially with the harvesters. I know Denis did that a lot with Blade Runner and Arrival as well. So
What do you think? Who was your favorite performance in the film? If you had to choose one of them, because or I guess not your favorite performance, but favorite character.
I really enjoyed Javier Bardem in this because he's just having so much fun.
He's a comedic relief where you didn't expect it.
Exactly. Like everyone else
Yeah.
in this is just like just completely going nuts and like taking it as seriously as if they're like on a Shakespearean like stage. And he is just like, he's almost like a Meryl Streep kind of character. He's just like very
Yeah.
effective and very enunciative in bringing this levity. And I know we're comparing a lot to Marvels, but in more traditional blockbusters, the comedy is very in your face. It's like, I guess he didn't see that coming, kind of stuff, and just
It's
like
like breaking the fourth wall and just ruining all credibility.
exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas if you can actually build the character to have the depth of Stilgar, where he has the ability to be believable as a fighter, as a leader, as a religious fanatic, but also he's pretty funny in how he like delivers his lines. To have that kind of person in this film just gives it the brevity it needs to not feel so weighted down, because you've got so many other big performances like making a lot of choices. Like I'm sure we'll talk about Austin Butler. I'm sure we'll talk about Rebecca Ferguson. They're making a lot of choices, and then Javier Bardem's just there, probably smoked a couple joints and having the time of his life. That's
Yeah.
I just really appreciated that performance.
I think the awesome or brilliance of the comedy in this is also there's like a darkness behind the comedy. You can tell that the character is joking, has a little bit of comedy to him because he wants himself to believe that so bad that this guy's the prophet.
Mm-hmm.
And which shows kind of real life how people in dark places need an external force to really push them along. So when he's really telling these people like, "Oh yeah, see he's humble, so he must be the prophet."
Yeah.
It's like it's funny, but at the same time it's like the darkness in that, because it's like I need this guy to be our savior. Like we need, instead of me finding the power within, I need someone else to, push me along. So I think there's a lot of that's also in the writing too, of course. I mean I know my answer is boring, but I don't know. I just think Timothy Chalamet's character is my favorite. It's like watching the first one. I was like, when it came out, I've always been a fan of Timothy Chalamet. I think he's very talented, of course. Like in the first one, I was like, he's talented. Like when you first watch Pirates of the Caribbean, how Orlando Bloom was talented. Like they're very good at being this, pretty boy. They're gonna have charisma on screen, but they're never gonna reach that next level of intensity, which I thought in this movie he certainly reached. By the end of the movie, I was scared of him. Even in the first, well, maybe it was like 10, 15 minutes of the movie, where Rebecca Ferguson, his mom, the character, tells him, your father was never into vengeance, and he's like, I am. Like I was like,
I believe
that's I was like, that's a powerful line. I thought that's also a badass line too. So
there's a good comp, and I get the Orlando Bloom one, but what came to my mind was Leo DiCaprio. Because through Titanic, Basketball Diaries, Romeo and Juliet, he's this like teenage heartthrob, like pretty guy that gets like some comedy roles and generally is like a dramatic actor in a just kid sense almost. Then when you get to stuff like The Departed, and especially The Departed, where you see that turn of like, oh, he can actually play kind of effed up. He can kind of play dark. He can go to a different space rather than just playing the same like Catch Me If You Can, The Beach kind of stuff. I got that kind of feeling from Chalamet's performance, where it's like this is really something we haven't seen from him at any point. Like
Yeah.
he's played complicated, he's played depressed, but he hasn't played commanding, leading role where you are a little scared and you actually believe him in his conviction. There was two other like there's two movies that really came to mind, especially not just the story and how it was made, but also just like the placement within the larger story. Empire Strikes Back and The Two Towers. This felt very those two like middle period. You have the context, but you also know you're going somewhere else.
I think it's going to be that big. Yes.
Mm-hmm. You think it's going to
Now,
be in the zeitgeist kind of stuff.
And Dark Knight as well is up there. I wish there was another universe where Austin Butler's character kills Timothée Chalamet at the end. Because I don't know anything about the books, but during that scene, I was like, I want Austin Butler to win. Like that will really put me into this story. Like, because I was like, that will like make things crazy and like unexpected. And I mean, when it ends, I'm like, there's zero chance that would ever happen. People would rage in the theater. I wanted like something in this movie, like because for example, Empire Strikes Back, Han Solo gets frozen. You don't know what's going to happen with that going forward. In The Dark Knight, Rachel dies. That was a scene where I was like, damn, this is real. You know, but I don't think there was anything in this movie where a character died, and I was like, now the stakes have risen insanely. Again, you can't like, they're not going to change the books this much. And I had never read the books. So while watching the movie, it's just, that's what I meant by subjective things that I thought were negative. Is there was stuff that I would have changed that a lot of other people wouldn't have. So at the end, when Fade was winning the fight, I was hoping that Josh Brolin would step in and get killed. So I was hoping something like that would happen to where you're like, now I really despise these people. Austin Butler's character, which was, I guess we're staying on characters here. Austin Butler, I thought his Fade was he was a fun villain. Again, I told you how he reminded me of Frieza from Dragon Ball Z, and I've heard other people compare him. He looked like him too, but there was just not enough of him for me to be like a super villain. He didn't show up halfway through the movie, and I get that because they didn't tell his story. They had a lot of story to tell. He still just seemed like the crazy cousin to me rather than like, I super fear this man. So if you would have done something at the end where it have been like, oh, now this guy's a piece of shit. Like like in Game of Thrones when Joffrey killed, the king, where you're like, oh, from now on, fuck this guy. Like, I can't wait till something bad happens to him.
I think they try and set him up, especially like in his opening, like even before like the Colosseum stuff, when he's in his chambers and there's like concubines and he's like getting his knives and all that kind of stuff, and he like kills two of them and he says he's gonna feed them to his other concubines. Like they're setting him up to be this like hedonistic badass that just needs to go down, basically. There's one thing which I think is worth bringing up, which is in the book, his character is present from the start. So Fade Rother isn't just like introduced halfway through. I think that was like a pretty good filmmaking decision because you want to sort of like hold something back for part two to like give it that freshness. Almost like, Rohan, I know you're not a Lord of the Rings guy, but Rohan being withheld until Two Towers, all that kind of stuff. So I think there was like a really good filmmaking decision there, but that came at the expense of having this built up idea of who he is rather than just like this hedonistic killer that just wants to kill and have sex and do all this like madman hot guy stuff.
Yeah, I thought he was such a badass character. Yeah. Like his acting was amazing. I think this movie is 2 hours 45 minutes. You could have made it 3:10.
Just give me 4. Just give me 4 hours of it. Just
yeah. I mean, I don't care how long it is. I'd watch all of it. But obviously, realistically, you could have made it 2 hours 59 minutes, and spent all that time doing something more with him, I guess. And for example, Skyfall, they don't show Javier Bardem's villain character until like 45 minutes, an hour into the movie.
Yeah.
And then when he comes down in that elevator, like he has this monologue where you're like, oh, this guy's terrifying.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're like, oh, this guy's psychotic.
Right.
And Austin Butler's, gladiator scene, he was killing people. I have like never met him. I don't care about him at all. So like when he's killing these people, I was like, oh, he's He's just another crazy villain.
Hmm.
All these people are crazy villains. They live at a black and white world.
Yeah.
So
Oh my gosh! Like, can we talk about that filmmaking choice? Because like the Harkonnen black sun and like everything when it's in the full sunlight, just white, and then his like blacked out teeth. That was just
mhm.
an insanely brilliant filmmaking choice in terms of
Oh, it's great. Yeah.
the contrast of the aesthetic between that and then like Dune slash Caladan. Like, you know, you've got all this bright desert, you've got texture, you've got color, and then
Mhm.
all you get here is this black and white, which I don't know if it was like a maybe this is too like high school English literature, but like just the black and white nature of the Harkonnens and just like they just care
Yeah.
about power and killing and all this kind of stuff, and they don't have this complexity behind them. I just think that was just such a brilliant way to break up the orange, for lack of a better word, the orange and the
Yeah.
brown, and really bring into this world like a depth that it really was missing. Because one thing I would say, and you were talking about like the score. What did you give to
Out of 193, so
93?
1 point
Okay.
away from a 5-star movie.
The one thing that I was really missing as I started to was leaving Caladan and arriving on Arrakis, because you get that stark contrast. You get the actual like
Yeah.
introduction of this world, but then when we finally get to Gedi Prime and you actually see the Harkonnen planet and introduction of Fade, that sort of like takes that place. So it kind of like notched a couple more points up in that sense, because you can't just be on Arrakis the whole time.
Honestly, like watching it the first time again, I didn't even know they switched planets. I was just like, I don't even
Mm-hmm.
know where they are.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's like knowing, this movie's so brilliant, but movies that have to cover so much places at once have that, like, for example, any biopic, they have to
Mm-hmm.
rush through so much stuff that like that you miss little details here and there.
Mm-hmm.
So this movie's like that, where it's so dense that they have to like cover so much stuff. Where even the first two movies, I think, could have been three
Yeah.
movies. But I mean, again, his character was awesome. I just wish there was more stuff fleshed out with him.
Yeah.
Even the Emperor, Christopher Walken, there wasn't anything he really did in the movie either that made me be like, this has pushed this guy over the edge.
Mm-hmm.
Aside from calling Oscar Isaac's character a weak man, but he didn't do anything in this film where I was like, oh, this guy's terrible.
Yeah, he's not like Emperor Palpatine kind of stuff.
Yes, Palpatine's like obviously like over the top, and
Yeah.
Palpatine, returns 30 years later. So,
Suddenly.
but suddenly, somehow, Palpatine's returned. These villains were all villains, but they
Mm.
never did anything. I feel like that really got me invested
Mm-hmm.
in what they were doing. I was very invested in the tragedy of what's going on with Timothy Chalamet's character,
Mm-hmm.
but the villains are still just like muhaha villains to me.
Like there's a psychological thing where the first people that you're really introduced to in a movie you root for, and like think of
Mm-hmm.
the Dark Knight. You as soon as you're introduced to all those robbers going through the bank and all this kind of stuff, and then you get to the Joker, you kind of like have this affinity with them almost.
Yeah,
I feel like that is kind of the same thing that's happened with Atreides and like Paul and his family, that whole clan, the House of Atreides stuff. At the end of part two, you realize that Paul has become this like fervent cult leader who's gonna wreck billions of lives, like kill billions of lives across the galaxy. Basically, is Paul a hero? I think that he's actually a pretty good villain from like
yeah,
a typical reading of something. In that same way, like the Harkonnens, I think it's pretty safe to say they're villains just because they've done some like pretty shady stuff. Obviously, with the ambush on Arrakeen, but the Emperor, he isn't given the chance to show anything villainous outside of just slandering Oscar Isaac, which is should be a federal crime anyway. But it kind of opens the door to thinking maybe this guy isn't a villain. Maybe the people that we've been rooting for this whole time, and that kind of goes
yeah.
into Game of Thrones as well. Like who are we actually rooting for? Breaking Bad, same thing. Like Walter White's just a drug like dealer guy who's actually wrecking people's lives just to make a bit of dough.
Well, what's your favorite scene of the movie then? Your number one, just favorite scene?
I think I have to go back to Paul riding the sandworm for the first time.
Yeah, I mean we're gonna be even on this. So
Yeah, I think that was my T-Rex is out of the paddock, holy shit moment. Just like
mm-hmm.
from like how they build it, how they shoot it. Sorry, cinematography. Like I don't take much to cry. I shed a tear just because of like the audacity to actually put that on film and just like show it in that way. It was like cinema's back, baby, kind of tear just like fell down my
Yeah, yeah.
face. But I think just like from the framing, they built it up so well with like, you know, again, Stilgar's humor of like, don't embarrass us, call a big one, and then he's like, not that big, and all this kind of stuff. Just like the way
Yeah.
they set it up and then actually shot it with him jumping off and trying to cling on and finally doing it. Man, I'm gonna remember that scene and watching that in the IMAX like for a long time. So that's probably my
You
favorite.
you know when Danny Villeneuve sent that scene to Hans Zimmer, he was like, "Let's go." He got that email and he like woke up in the middle of the night
He
and he
just
was like,
ascended.
assembled his orchestra team. I was like, "Are you guys ready to cook?" Because when he finally stands up and just go, ah, I'm just like, "Shoot, man,
Yeah.
this is." There's and the
Yeah.
theater's just like shaking too.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean that's my favorite scene too. One thing I remember when I watched it yesterday, where I was just like, you just want to start swinging at stuff when it happens. Is so at the end, obviously, like the really badass shot where the worms come out of the dust storm and attack the city. But then it switches over to Paul Atreides walking through the desert, looking like Anakin's ass just killed a bunch of kids. He's like walking through the desert, and you have this army of like thousands behind him.
Mm-hmm.
Oh man, I was just like, I I wanted to be there. I was
Yeah.
just like, dang, let's go tear this up.
Yeah. One of my hot takes is that I think this movie is doing the best when it's more like a political palace intrigue kind of stuff with like the Bene Gesserit.
Mm-hmm.
I love that kind of stuff. So
Yes.
obviously I love the sandworms and the fights and the filming of it is incredible. But I think there's so much political underpinnings which really enrich this story. So yeah, what about like the non set piece kind of scenes really stuck out to you?
So there's the lady who's with Florence Pugh, the mom. What's
Oh,
her name?
Charlotte Rampling. She's the Reverend Mother of the
Yeah,
Bene Gesserit. Yeah,
I just wish Alina was in this movie so she could play that part. Like, so there, that's what I was thinking of is like when those two are talking, I was like, it's like I really like that stuff. When
tell
Florence
the
Pugh's
Baron it
character,
was me.
yeah, that's what I the vibes. That's the vibes I got from that lady.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, I get that.
how like she just seemed to know more than everyone,
Yeah.
and she's like, Emperor's a little bitch compared to me. Like I can manipulate all these men
Mm-hmm.
just with my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And she's kind of like talking to I can tell, like, again, I haven't read the books, I can tell just by how this movie was going that Florence Pugh's character is big in the future. Their banter together, I was like,
Mm-hmm.
I felt like the chess pieces moving
Mm-hmm.
whenever they were talking,
Mm-hmm.
like behind the scenes. Whenever I felt like all the men were doing stuff, it was a lot more like I'm going to use my force for
Mm-hmm.
power. When they were talking, it was like I'm playing the long game here.
Yeah, we're playing chess.
So
Yeah.
yeah, even Rebecca Ferguson's character,
Mm-hmm.
she was manipulating everything. My favorite stuff that was not action based was definitely the mom and Florence Pugh
Mm-hmm.
talking. I felt something sinister behind that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and anything that was going to happen, I felt she was like, "Yeah, I knew this was going to happen. Oh yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I knew he's still alive, but
Mm-hmm.
don't tell the Emperor that." I
Yeah.
thought that was really cool stuff. So in the first film, in his visions, he sees Zendaya kill him. During this film, I was like, something's going to happen to where she doesn't like him.
Mm-hmm.
So
Like you thought that she was
I
actually gonna like kill him.
not in this film,
Mm-hmm.
but I was like, something's gonna happen to where like it turns, the tide here.
Mm-hmm.
But then there was that, which is really such an awesome detail. In the first film, he has that vision, Paul Atreides does, where he's fighting in the battle, and they use that same camera angle in this
Yeah,
film
and it's
for
there.
Zendaya's
Yeah,
character.
that was so
And
good.
I was like, that shows that his visions are not fully correct.
Realized. Yeah.
And I was like, that's awesome. Because
Mm-hmm.
that's such a cool detail
Mm-hmm.
where now I'm like, he's not seeing everything that's truly going to happen. He
Mm-hmm.
sees stuff that's kind of like mixed up a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So it also makes me be like, I don't know if she's going to kill him. Maybe he kills her. I don't know what's going to happen. And I think that's really cool.
I won't
Is,
say anything.
is,
Like I'm not gonna like spoil it, just because I think it's gonna be interesting to see how Denis actually interprets, because he's already made a lot of changes.
yeah.
So like big changes, like Alia, who is Paul's sister, Anya Taylor-Joy. in the book, she's already been born at this point.
Oh,
Yeah, which was an interesting choice. Um, in the book, years go by
yeah.
after he has the water of life. Like he's in a coma for like a month after taking the water of life. In the movie, it feels like 10 minutes. Um, so there's already a lot of changes, which I think actually held up from a storytelling perspective to sort of just help it move along in a film sense. But it's more like a it almost reminded me of like a Shakespeare. I get a lot of Shakespearean stuff from this movie in general, just like the overtones of power and family, fate, ascendancy, all this kind of stuff. But also the political machinations of who do I marry for an alliance? Who am I gonna put myself with? Am I gonna devote myself to the woman who I fell in love with in the desert, or am I actually gonna make a decision for the future of the galaxy, basically? So um, I'll leave it at that. I don't think that's a spoiler, but there's more to be told for Chani's story, especially.
I guess we can move on to. I know this is the tough question here. Your favorite shot of the movie, favorite cinematography scene, and again, you can only choose one. So I don't want to hear like, oh, I really like this one, but no, just say one.
um, well, I know that we mentioned the levitating Harkonnen squad at the start of the movie going up the cliff, so I see that as like a joint like honorable mention. So I'm gonna just like quickly sidestep that. Um, this is kind of like a odd choice, but all of the stuff with like fetus Alia, I absolutely
Oh, really?
loved. I loved it because one of my favorite movies is 2001: Space Odyssey, and there's a lot of like
Yeah, it's very similar.
space baby kind of stuff. But just the way that they use those shots to sort of ground it um, emotionally, because all these huge political machinations are going on, and there's like the fates of people and people's planets, all this kind of stuff. But then at the core of the story is this sort of like mother daughter relationship and like what she will become. So I think actually having the shots of, especially when Lady
Oh,
Jessica,
that's the
that's
most simple name. I won't forget that one. It's an
it's like
actual name.
barely Arabic. Oh my gosh. When Lady Jessica like takes the water of life and like it awakens the mind of the child within her, and you see those like bright blue eyes, I just like roaring almost, and there's like an incredible piece of Zimmer music underneath it as well. I just think that kind of brings together like the mysticism but also the human element perfectly, and like grounds it in a relationship and in a person and in a decision. So I'm going to go with that stuff as just a bit of a curveball because there's just too much to talk about with the landscapes and the way they shoot the desert and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I told you about that off recording about that documentary Samsara that you need to
I need to
watch.
watch that. Yeah.
There's one shot that reminded me a lot of Samsara. And
Hmm.
that was like the overhead shot of Paul Atreides walking through like thousands of people. Like and they're just like
Mm.
parting a little circle like while he's and they
Hmm.
filled the whole screen. And that reminded me a lot of Samsara shot from
Hmm.
that
I thought
from
you were
that
going to say
documentary.
Battle of the Bastards.
Battle of the Bastards, I still think
Because it's
is
like
the greatest
overhead
film.
and it's like looking up, that kind of like same shot.
Yeah, I think Battle of Bastards to me is still, I mean, the greatest battle scene of all time, in my
Mm.
opinion.
I find that
So
kind of interesting that we both chose like human moments in terms of like the grand vista stuff of like what is actually being shot from a environmental thing.
yeah, because I mean, a lot of the war shots were badass, but at
Hmm.
the same time, they were CGI as well, not
Hmm.
only just cinematography. And I mean, we've seen them all before. Of
Fair.
course, like how the story leads up to it is how much you care about the moment. We've talked about villains quite a bit, about our favorites and whatnot. I guess we can, that we've gloated about how amazing this movie is with positives. Move on to those negatives.
Hmm.
And again, like these are subjective. When I see a negative in this film, I have true belief that Denis Villeneuve knows that negative is there. And
Hmm.
he's like, I have to put this in this movie to continue along the
It's a
story. You know what
compromise.
I mean? It's a compromise
Yeah.
rather than like people who don't know what the fuck they're doing type
Mm-hmm.
of thing. Or just like, or people that know what they're doing, but they're like, that's going to take too much work. We're not going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like there's a big difference between, compromise and like,
Effort.
no, we don't, we'll get the money we need anyway. So who
Yeah.
cares? When I was comparing now the Battle of the Bastards, the Battle of the Bastards is so epic, obviously because they had an hour to show that on screen.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think if this movie would have been 3 hours long or 3:10, and they would have tacked on 15 minutes to that final battle, it would have
Mm-hmm.
made it a masterpiece to me. Like it would have made this movie, because the intro to the fight was so amazing, but then out of nowhere, Paul Atreides is already inside of
Yeah.
the corridor with the Emperor, and I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, that
That was
was
quick.
fast.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was probably my number one negative,
Mm-hmm.
was just how like it didn't show. And again, I mean, he probably had a certain amount of budget, and he's like, I'm gonna put it towards having an extremely badass 5 minutes rather than a less badass 20 minutes, and it would look
Mm-hmm.
worse. And I trust that he was probably like, I'm sure he thought about it.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way that he didn't think like, oh, this is too short.
Yeah.
So,
I think that's a lot of
uh,
why it's taken so long to actually adapt this book, because so many people have had to make those decisions and they haven't been in a position to actually make a good decision of like what to
yeah,
cut, what to keep, what to compromise on. There's just too much to actually adapt to make it a literal adaptation, which I don't think is necessary to make a good movie in the first place. But you know, the amount of time compression that they needed to take place, which they actually used the pregnancy as a really good framing device for that, because in the book there is like these years that span over the course of what happens actually in this movie, but because you actually have this pregnancy to sort of like act as like a metronome of like keeping time of what is happening, how long something's taken, that kind of is a nice device to help with that. But then when you get to something like, the entire first movie is built up, and a good part of part two are built up of, wow, the Harkonnens are pretty evil, this is going to take a while. And then, like you were saying, like there's the incredible assault on Arrakeen and the sandworms, and I'll get to the atomic warheads in a second in terms of negatives.
yeah,
There's so much built up of like the Emperor is untouchable, the Harkonnens are pure evil and just like brutal and gonna destroy everything. And then all of a sudden, after a relatively quick, in terms of what is shown on the movie, assault on Arrakeen, like the Emperor is off his throne, the Baron's crawling up the steps, like with that throne in sight, which was quite a nice little shot actually. But then, Paul just
that was
walks
cool.
in.
Yeah,
Paul just walks in and just like stabs and says grandfather, because oh yeah, we didn't even mention that Paul was actually a Harkonnen this whole time.
uh,
Um,
no, that's because Star Wars ruined that, and it pisses me off.
yeah,
So,
that was
and
the I am your father moment in this movie.
yes, but I think Denis Villeneuve was very smart to
Mm-hmm.
not make it like this grandiose thing. Like he
Yes.
skipped over it quickly because he knew that people were going to see that and be like, we've seen this before.
Yeah, I agree.
So, and Star Wars, of course, the I Am Your Father was famous, but then they, of course, stupidly in the last Star Wars movie did that shit of, oh, I'm actually, Snoke's whatever.
Let's not do this, bro.
You
Let's
know what I
enjoy
mean?
life. What are we doing?
So
Yeah,
so I'm saying that's so you can tell like he really knows like, oh, my audience is gonna feel a certain way.
yeah,
So I'm gonna like throw that in there quickly because I
yeah.
have to, because it's
It's the book.
essential to the story.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I'm not gonna make it this like
Huge plot point.
quiet. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. It was
this
just like
like
he woke up from his vision,
internal
mentioned
like
it.
quandary of like, what is my identity? Am I Harkonnen? Am I Atreides at heart? All this kind of stuff. There could have been a lot of just like ham-fisted exposition again into that. So I'm really thankful that he compromised there, for example. But then, there's only 20 Sardaukar guarding the Emperor at the end of this, and like they just
Yeah,
get like completely wiped out without a
well,
fuss,
of course.
of course, which
Yeah,
that just felt kind of cheap, given that we've just spent almost 4 hours building them up as unbeatable. Um, so that was I think, a
it
result
was
of the,
easy.
yeah, it was easy. It was a result of the time compression that we're sort of talking about, where you have to make those compromises to advance the story. So I think one critique that people have of Denis' filmography is that it's pretty sterile and kind of cold emotionally. Um, and I think that he's actually a lot more emotive than people give him credit. We'll get to this when we talk about like his filmography a bit later on. But one part where I feel that is justified criticism is with Zendaya's character, because after he takes the water of life and he wakes up and all this kind of stuff and accepts his position as Lazan Al Gaib, I feel like she maybe has 3 lines of dialogue, but like half an hour of screen time just scowling and looking angry. And I just think that they maybe could have done a little more emotionally speaking to communicate her frustration with his decisions, and like even before we get to the Princess Irulan like decision of like taking her hand, there was like a coldness to that kind of change in the relationship, which probably could have been fleshed out a little more.
Yeah,
Um, but then the biggest nitpick I have is the atomic warheads, which kind of like they're part of the lore, and there's points in the book that it's like referenced, so that like plays it lays that underground underpinning, sorry, to actually like use them. But because they're not mentioned at any point, it just felt like a real Deus ex machina of like, oh, and we just remembered we have these nuclear warheads that we can use to attack the city. It's just that kind of felt cheap in the moment, and even if they just referenced it when they were leaving Caladan in part one of like, okay, the atomic warheads are loaded, we can go now, and just sort of like put
yeah,
that in our minds rather than, oh, so they actually had these 92 nukes this whole time and all of their solutions are solved. It just felt a bit cheap. So that was one thing I was just kind of meh about.
yeah. I felt the same way where I was like, I just kind of ignored it. Where I was like,
Mm,
oh, sure, nukes.
yeah.
Like, I guess.
But then
Is
you
that
get
what
that
I was like?
absolutely sick shot of them nuking Iraqi, and then Paul's looking over, and there's just like this ripple wave of like shockwave stuff.
Yeah, but
That's
I
pretty
feel like
cool.
they could have pulled the same thing with just having to be a regular bomb, like just
Yeah.
launching a. I don't know, but yeah, I felt that same way. Where it was like, oh, out of nowhere we have, you know, we found these Cold War era Russian nukes that have been hiding. No, what I did take out of it is, yeah, it's an insanely good movie, and I'm really glad that it's made and it's out because I think it's great for the movie theaters. I think it's great for the algorithms to see what actually works. And same thing with like, I don't think there's superhero fatigue. I don't think at all. I think it's
Mm,
mediocre film fatigue. You're seeing the same you're seeing the same box office numbers with many blockbusters because they're just being thrown out there. If a good superhero movie is made, then people will go see it. In a sense, Dune is kind of a superhero movie, like it's kind of out there. So
mm-hmm.
it's really good that they have someone who put this much care into a movie and it's this good.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, yeah, I'm very intrigued in what's next. I also want to know because he said, Danny Villeneuve said he's only making 3 of these,
Mm-hmm.
so I feel like it has to be very strategic.
Yeah.
On one end, I'm like, let's try to just make. Maybe you can take moments from a lot of the books and just put them into the third one, and end it with a third one. Or are we planning on like making it a 5, 6 movie,
Mm-hmm.
thing, or kind of like Harry Potter where it goes on? Harry Potter had many different directors,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of the films are fantastic. I don't know if there's one bad Harry Potter movie. I'm not including Mr. Beast, obviously, though. No, but I mean, talking about the actual like original Harry Potter movies, I don't know if there's a single one that I would call bad.
I just don't think it can be overstated what an incredible piece of adaptation this is, because not only has
Mm-hmm.
it been like lauded as this unadaptable tome and story, but to actually make it in such a way where people that go in without any context love it. People who have read all the books religiously and keep going back to it love it. I think that is like such an impossibly hard thing to do, and just kind of speaks to like Denis' adept touch when it comes to his movies. Um, I feel like he's been spending his entire career sort of building to this point. And we'll go through the filmography in a second, but you see some of the shots in Arrival and like how he's learning how to operate with space in Blade Runner, and then obviously like some of the action sequences in Sicario. I feel like he's like been building little blocks up to actually adapt Dune, which is what he's been wanting to do since he was 14, as we said. But actually
Yeah.
using his movies beforehand as proving grounds. So I just think it was just, I can't overstate just what an achievement it is that this even works at such a level. Um, I really appreciate how he brings in so much outside commentary, even if it's like subtle. Like there's so many different readings you can get of this. Like you can get like an ecological reading of like what are we doing to our planet. You can get like Shakespearean stuff. I shouldn't say Shakespearean and stuff. That sounds awful and not English literature. A lot of like colonialistic readings and all that kind of thing. I even thought of like the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan for oil,
Yeah,
and
no, absolutely.
as
I
a
think that's a lot
political.
of the themes in this.
Exactly. So I think like to tie all of that in and to make it as powerful, regardless of whatever mileage you have with the source material, like this guy is making blockbusters how they should be. It's just huge in scale, huge in ideas, but respects the audience and like respects the intellect to keep up, put things together without all this expository stuff. And honestly, like this could be a turning point in how blockbusters are made. I pray it is because we need more of this than what we've been getting.
All right, guys. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to do a review, or we're going to do a rankings of Denis Villeneuve's films. We're going to do his 7 films in the rankings. None of these are in order right now, but we're going to do Enemy Prisoners, Dune 1, Dune 2, Arrival, Sicario. I think that's all of them that
Blade
he's
Runner.
named. Blade Runner 2049. So all of his American films, basically his wide releases here in the States. We're gonna make them. We're gonna be very brief on them, like 30 seconds each. We're not gonna do full reviews on these. Starting off with number 7, I mean, it is Enemy. None of these movies are bad. Enemy is, of course, my least favorite, but he made that. Was he make that like while he was making
Yeah.
Prisoners or something weird and
Yeah.
crazy? I guess it's the most out there movie. I mean, still very enjoyable to watch. I mean, it makes your brain turn. But
Mm-hmm.
that's my number 7 is Enemy.
Yeah, my number says Enemy as well. This I rated a 4 out of 5. Everything else from this point is at least a 4.5 for me. So
Mm-hmm.
Denis is probably my favorite currently working filmmaker. So Enemy was a really fun starting point. I love what he did with like ego and like self-reflection, the spiders, all that kind of stuff. It was a really fun starting point. But this is gonna be like, oh, I'm hurting inside just even thinking about the rest. Oh.
Yeah, it is tough. Yeah. Well, my number 6, Blade Runner 2049. Absolutely. This is some people's like absolute favorite movie of all time. A lot of people love it more than the first one. The first one didn't connect with me, and this one didn't connect with me. It is still insanely gorgeous to look at. It is an achievement in filmmaking. However, it's just still, I feel very detached watching it. So that's why it's my number 6.
Uh, oh god, I already hate this. My number 6 is Prisoners. I absolutely love this movie, so putting it at 6 is really hard.
Yeah.
But I feel like a degenerate for liking this movie just because it's so messed up and it's so disturbing and affecting. I think this is probably Jake Gyllenhaal's best performance, and
Yes.
just
Yeah. Agreed.
some of the cinematography that Roger Deakins is doing on this, and I'm sure we're going to talk about Roger Deakins again. But wow, I just needed a shower after watching this movie, so it was just so icky, but I love it. Number 6.
Yeah. I was thinking about watching it again today. Number 5 is going to be the first Dune. I definitely enjoyed it. Loved it. All these movies are just amazing. But number 5 is Dune. It was still. I felt like it was the perfect setup to the second Dune part. It was really good introduction to the world. The only like small issues I had was I didn't know what was going on the first time watching it. I was like, oh, this is just a bunch of cool B-roll. But I love it a lot more now than I did then. But it still sits at my number 5.
Mm-hmm. My number 5 is Blade Runner 2049. For a while, I did think this was like my favorite. I was one of those guys. I wasn't like one of those like Ryan Gosling is me like fan movie edit guys.
Yeah.
But just like the imagery, the symbolism, I think it really advanced the story really well from where the first Blade Runner started off, and like talked about identity really well. But just in terms of like composition, sound, visual, everything, like
Yes.
vibe, my gosh, just incredible. Maybe a bit long, maybe a bit up its own butt, but my word, that was a really fun movie. So yeah, my number five.
Better than the original two or no?
No.
No. Okay. My number four is Prisoners. I mean, you echoed everything amazing about it. It is pretty terrifying to see that happen to a parent, just break down. I haven't watched it, I don't think, since 2014. So I really need to watch that one again. It's kind of dark to go to, of course. Paul Dano is
Oh,
amazing in that movie as
yeah,
well.
it's
So, I mean, that dude's a little, he's a freak. He's a freak elite. But yeah, so my number four is Prisoners.
My number four is the first Dune for everything we've already talked about. Just incredible setting of a story. Just loved that world from the first moment that we stepped into it, and just like how story is like carried out. But part two is my number three. I just feel like they're a continuation and just can't really be separated in my mind. But I'll speak on three in a second. So yeah, number four, Dune part one.
Yeah, so for the next three, it's kind of like every single racing movie where they have a side by side and all movie, and there's like one like that's like half a millimeter in front. That's how like the last three
Yeah.
of these movies are kind of to me. Number three is Arrival. I still feel disgusting putting this at three. I still remember when I watched this movie and the ending happened. I was like, this is one of the best twists I've ever seen, as in like how it emotionally impacted me. And I was like immediately texting people after the movie. I was just being like, I love you. Like it was like I just want to let you know. Like it was a crazy feeling. I remember leaving that movie. It just like had so much thoughts going through my head. But
Mhm,
yeah, Rival is my number three.
mhm. So yeah, Dune part two for three for me. Just in terms of like how it advanced the story from part one, but then just built on like the thematic side of things, especially with like the mysticism, like the Fremen, the complex villainy that we talked about, all of the overtones that Denis brought into it. I just think it was just incredible. It's really tough because it could on any given day be six, but today, just after watching it recently, it's
Yeah.
number three.
Yeah, Dune Part Two is my number two. So yeah, I mean we talked about it in a lot. Who this could change in the future, who knows? But yeah, number two, Dune Part Two.
Number two, Sicario. Man, what a movie! Oh my god, this is really tough. Um,
Yeah.
wow, you see so much in like the fight scenes in part two of Dune, like where he's drawn from Sicario, but like again, more complex villainy and like who to trust. But um, I think for me, Sicario is great story, obviously great acting, especially by Benicio del Toro. But this is where Roger Deakins, lifetime award, just my word, just absolutely incredible. Some of the stuff he's doing with the camera, and then paired with Denis' vision of like Mexico and what he's able to do with that landscape and the complex nature of the federal government and all these storylines like interwoven and
Yeah.
it's a really short movie like considering everything else that he's done. It's like I think it's just about 2 hours movie, 2 hour long movie, but it just rattles on at an incredible pace and just you'd be hard pressed to find a better 2 hour movie. So
Yeah, you just Star Wars what Star Wars did to Dune. You just did that to my
it's
my number one is Sicario. I think it's always going to be. I don't know if he'll ever make a better movie for me than that. Uh, I can rewatch that movie so many times because I just like find brilliance in it. And I do agree. 50 that movie's like 50-50 Roger Deakins, 50-50 Denis Villeneuve.
mm-hmm,
Like there's so many movies made about the cartel, and for some reason that one just stands out and just terrifies you
mm-hmm.
more than anything. That the dinner scene at the end is just isn't, and this it's also Emily Blunt's greatest acting she's done, I
Agree.
think,
Yeah,
in a
yeah.
movie. So everything about that film, I I think I have that at no, maybe I have it as 4.5 stars, but I think I'm not sure. It's close to a 5 star for me, and everyone in that movie is brilliant. So I wonder what your number one is. It's tough.
It's Arrival. It's Arrival.
Yeah.
I feel like this movie is like made in a lab for me. I have given 9 movies a 5-star rating on Letterboxd, and this is one of them. And this is one of like it's in my 4 favorites of all time, personally. Um, I studied linguistics in college, so like all of the linguistic elements of like Sapir-Whorf theory and like how language impacts mind, and then like the time twist and like what life is, what meaning is, what a day is, who we are to one another. I just I watched it recently after we had Leo, our boy, and oh, I just yeah,
The ending
it's
erupts you.
just horrible. It's just horrible, but at the same time, it's so life affirming and hopeful.
I
It's
know.
just like, wow, this
I know.
sucks. I love it. It's just really complex, but um, I feel like there hasn't been a more human movie made involving aliens. And
No,
um,
but it's not really about aliens
no,
because
it's
like
about us.
it's crazy.
Yeah.
I again the twist in that movie
Hmm.
is not talked about
Yeah,
enough.
just how it's
The
constructed, the puzzle pieces that have to go in at the right place, all the drip feeding of information, how it looks like it's so muddy and dirty, and yet there can just be like this energy that comes out of it that just feels so like life affirming while also just soul crushing. It's just yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
All right. So yeah, we went over Dune Part Two. Great times, great experience. I don't know what the next deep dive will be this year. It might be the Joker. It might be I don't know if Tarantino's movie comes out this year, but thanks Matthew for joining.
thanks for having me.
Very I don't know. I honestly don't know if anything's gonna beat this as the number one of the year when the end of year comes out. I feel like we've gone through a month, 2 months now in 2024. We already have an easy number one worst and an easy number one best, I think. So yeah. But yeah, thanks for joining. And we will see you guys next time. Don't forget to subscribe.